of the Intact Global Conference. A round of applause. We had a great first day. Every speaker was compelling, engaging, great questions. We want to keep up the energy. It was beautiful. Great to see you all again. Now, a little feedback is, great day, but no breaks. And so we're gonna incorporate some breaks into the schedule today, right? So a little round of applause for that. For you, John. Again, lunch is going to be served inside today. The Sentinel did a beautiful job, so thank you to the Sentinel. And just so we're all aware for the live stream and also everyone sitting in here, I'm sure, I would say all, but most of you have some type of social media, whether it be Instagram or X or Blue Sky, you name it. Make sure you open your phone and you follow Intact Global Inc., right? At Intact Global Inc. We're trying to boost up the social media. It is one of the pillars of our mission here at Intact Global to educate and engage the public, right? How do we protect children from genital cutting, right? There's been a couple changes in schedule. One of our speakers fell ill, certified flu. The other is taking care of his elderly father who's not doing well, and so we do what we can. But we have other great speakers coming in. We've got Steve Scott to talk about the anatomy. Hopefully Daniel Stranford will talk maybe a few minutes about what's going on in Europe. Daniel Rold will talk about, okay, how do we get local media engaged? Because that really amplifies our mission. But the theme stays the same. Today it's mostly intact litigators, right? Lawyers who have been engaged in this movement for anywhere from years to decades, right? A lot of experience, litigation, advocacy, policy, you name it. And Tim Hammond, wherever you are, hello Tim. So Tim asked me to ask you all, grab some literature. We have another room over there with local groups, including GalDef, who printed out info. It's kind of like preaching to the choir here, so you guys are all aware, but you can give it to other people you know who are having children. Say, look, this is a handout, so you don't have to stand there and tell them, although you should, look, don't cut your baby. This is harmful. We want to protect all children. So anyway, without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker, a longtime friend of mine, a lifelong intactivist, who also, like me, got terminated for his intactivism, and unlike me, he won his case, right? So he brought his case up to the California Supreme Court, some rule that protected banks unfairly. Martin challenged it and prevailed, so kind of a legend there, and also in the movement, we're very excited to welcome Martin Novoa. So please, round of applause for Martin. You can put it down here.
Okay, great.
And did you have a microphone? Okay, no problem. I'll just take it.
Use this. Ah, right. Thanks. Hi everyone. I'm Martin. As Eric said, I'm a long time intactivist. I really started doing this work when I was 12 years old, and that was 54 years ago. So it's more than half a century I've been doing this, and I'll explain some of that in a minute. But Eric is correct. In the course of my getting fired for my intactivism, I challenged it, and one unexpected result of that was that we ended up overturning California law, 100 years worth of California law in how officers of a financial corporation were treated. So that was a benefit, not just for me, but for many people who had cases after mine. So, I'm kind of a bridge between, some of you went through that with me. Some of you know very well, what happened. That's when I was living here on the West Coast, living in San Francisco. I currently live in the Fort Lauderdale area in Florida. It was a long trip in here. But I see myself speaking early today as kind of a bridge between the Intact Coalition speakers we had yesterday and the Intact litigators who make up the bulk of today's presentations. Give you a little bit of my background. I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I did go to law school. My history is after William and Mary, this is a shout out for you. We went to the same, Sammer and I went to the same college. After that, I took a break. I worked on Capitol Hill. I went back to college and I started where I had been an undergrad. And after a year of going to college there, I happened to apply for and won a scholarship to get an MBA at the University of Chicago. So I approached them and said, could I transfer into the law program here, and I'll do a JD MBA at Chicago. So I continued my law studies up at U of C, but I never sat for the bar because I went straight to Wall Street using the MBA part of my education and to some extent the legal part of it. So that's where the bulk of my career was, in New York, then Chicago, and ultimately in San Francisco, where I worked for many years. So what I'm talking about today, the main thing, the theme of my talk is triage in the circumcision crisis. And I'm focusing specifically on the United States, but drawing from the history of many other countries. And when I say triage, nurses know what I'm talking about. It's prioritization of the cases that come before you. And in this case, I'm talking about let's go for the most bang for the buck first, and the things that are going to make the greatest difference, and work our way down. Because a lot of people come into activism and they say, you know what, I've been reading up on this subject. It's a terrible situation the US finds itself in, but I'm going to work really hard, and we're going to talk to every mom and dad in America, and we're going to end this in 5 years. That's not how it works. We've tried that. Like people said yesterday, never miss an opportunity to talk to your friends and family and even strangers on the Portland tram. Just talk to anyone about circumcision and make sure they haven't missed the message. Because one of the saddest things to hear is the regret of people who say, I never would have done this if I had known. I wouldn't have cut my kid. And that is entirely preventable, and to some extent within our power. I'm sure I didn't knock off anything important. I don't have a fancy PowerPoint presentation. I have some pictures that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. One of the things that we talked about that is really effective is street activism. Bloodstained Men is a great organization. My friend Jonathan Conte, late Jonathan Conte, brought the idea over from the UK, where Richard Dunker had started this idea of stationary street art. Just basically men holding hands or standing perfectly still with a red blood stain. Jonathan brought the idea, I think it was to the New Orleans protest, and had these costumes made up with the blood stain. And Brother Kay ran with the idea. He said, let's turn it into moving art. We're going to carry signs. We're not just going to stand there and have people mull about us like we're statues and try to figure out what the message is. We're going to shout the message at them. So one of the most effective, wonderful protests we had was right here in Portland in 2016, summer of 16. And we had in our crew an amazing photographer who lived in Gresham. Now Timothy lives in Florida. But Tim captured us in photos, and I don't know if this is going to work. But some of you have seen this picture before. It's kind of an iconic intactivist image. And that's Brother Kay in the middle holding up the signs. And if you look at the person who's on the left of the screen in front saying circumcision removes 16 plus functions, that's me. So we were really noticeable here in Portland. We were unmistakable. People still talk about that protest. And I have a few more pictures from that protest to show you in a bit. But let me jump into a little bit more of my history. They forced us into gym showers when I was 12, junior high school, summer of 1971. I remember it like it was yesterday. And we were all kind of traumatized because we were from an era where it really wasn't normal to undress in front of your friends. Back in the US in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, it was the most normal thing in the world. boys did their swim practices at school and the swim meets, even the regional and state meets, completely naked. A lot of people don't realize this, they don't remember that. There was no shame in the body. And I'm very much involved with the naturist, the nudist movement in the United States as well. I'm president, my day job is I'm president of one of the largest naturist organizations that covers Canada, the US, and Mexico. And people often say to me, where did this shame that we feel today come from? And I've identified 5 different factors, but one of the factors is actually circumcision. It's the rise of circumcision because there is an unspoken shame associated with that a lot of people don't realize. It started out when just about all the boys were intact, that everybody looked the same. It didn't matter if you didn't have a swimsuit on at the YMCA or at your high school swim practice, because everybody had a penis that looked pretty much the same. And then as circumcision filtered into this, you had the mix of boys. You had boys with markedly different penis statuses. And then you got to several decades later, where the intact boys were very much in the minority, and it was their time to be ashamed. So the circumcised boys initially wanted to hide from the arguably normal boys, and then several decades later, you had the situation reversed, where the intact boys were self-conscious about being different from the norm. So this really struck me the first time I had to get nude with my friends, with my classmates, and I'd known most of these guys from elementary school also. So their initial reaction was to be very uncomfortable in that situation. And we quickly noticed who was cut and who wasn't. It was kind of unmistakable. For many, many years, I resented being forced into that situation because you couldn't get out of it with a doctor's note or a parent's note or anything. But now I see that it was a great bonding experience. It took our friendships to a different, more intimate level. And I am still I'm friends with most of those guys today from when I was 12 years old. One of them, half an hour ago, I just wished him a happy birthday today. So we're still really close friends, and I think that was part of it. But we never lost the idea of why is this circumcision being done. I then went on to high school where we didn't have to shower together, but I was an exchange student in Germany. And first thing I noticed was we did have to shower after PE class there. And I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later on when we do the interviews. Nobody in my class, including me, was circumcised. So my teenage brain was trying to reconcile this. Why 2 of the most economically, technologically, medically advanced countries in the world have such a dramatically different approach to this? Either circumcision is necessary and you need to do it to just about all the boys, or it's unnecessary and potentially harmful and you shouldn't do it to anyone. And so there I stood at 16 years old trying to figure out, how do I reconcile this? How does this make any sense? And so I dedicated myself, from the time we started the showers when I was 12, and really rededicated myself around the time of the US bicentennial to understanding circumcision and knowing what was right and what was wrong. And that led to involvement in this movement for the next 40 years after that. And we have a better handle on it, but we don't have all the answers to facing it. And we need to do a better job of that. What really stands out to me is that money is a massive factor in this. Now, we have history to draw on from countries like the UK, which got into infant circumcision around the same time we did, in the late 19th century, and Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, other countries where this Anglo idea of infant circumcision as a good intervention had spread. We also know that they managed to get out of it, and South Korea has extricated itself from its schoolboy age circumcision fad, which is almost universal, to dwindling now. So what can we learn from those countries? The easy answer is they have universal health care. for the entire nation, and it doesn't pay for circumcision. And when you don't have that incentive, you don't have pressure from the medical profession on parents to get it done. It turns out that the real answer is more complex than that. But the subsidies, the money issue in the United States is a very real problem. And we see that in real time with those states that have eliminated infant circumcision from their Medicaid programs. They almost immediately, almost overnight, within the first year of deleting that, have a lower infant circumcision rate. That happened in my own state of Florida. In 2003, the great intactivists Van Lewis and his brother Ben, they had been lobbying the Florida legislature for years to get infant circumcision out of Medicaid, and they succeeded in 2003. Our rate went from 70% to about 33% in a period of about 2 years. It was a marvelous thing to see. It was a dramatic change. And then the legislature effectively put it back in 2014, and the rate went right up to 65%. So we can actually track this. We can see the effect of money in the circumcision equation. It's a critically important part. And Florida didn't do it directly. They did it the sneaky way. And be on the lookout for this in the other states that eliminate this. Florida decided to privatize Medicaid. So what they did was they gave a set amount of money to companies that came in with HMOs and PPOs. Florida selected 12 different companies. So each region of the state had got somewhere between 3 and 5, depending on the size of the region, of these private companies that were offering health insurance plans, ostensibly as Medicaid, as privatized Medicaid. And Florida said you have to cover a certain minimum of things, and circumcision was not one of these things. You have to cover a minimum, but anything else that you want to sweeten your plan with on your own dime, go for it. And of those 12 insurers that had been handpicked by Florida to offer private Medicaid programs, 11 of them instantly put circumcision in, saying it's a crowd favorite. And Tim can attest to this because when he did that research in San Francisco, when we were living in San Francisco, the response from the insurance companies was, we know we can save money by not covering circumcision. We know it's not necessary. That's been clear since the AAP pronounced in 1971 that there's no medical indication for circumcision in the neonatal period. But, as Tim said, it's a competitive issue. It's a game of chicken. Unless they all drop it at the same time, then they're going to keep it in so that they're not at a competitive disadvantage. Now, one area that this doesn't typically happen is when Medicaid drops it. What we have seen is that private insurers in the state, and I personally would never have thought that Medicaid was a direct competitor to private insurance, but I guess it is. When a state drops infant circumcision from Medicaid, the private insurers drop it too, en masse. They all get themselves out of the business, and then parents have nowhere to turn for subsidies, which is a beautiful thing. I'm not one of those who's of the opinion that we have to level the playing field so that poorer families have the same shot at circumcision as richer families. First of all, that overlooks the fact that the trend away from circumcision is really coming from the most educated and well-to-do segments of society. But it is a fact that private insurance responds to Medicaid. So we really, I think, I'm going to list that as the #1 most effective thing we can do, and Anthony knows this well, because you have targeted that as a primary project for intaction. And I think that's the right thing. That's putting the effort where the returns are going to be some of the greatest. Now, why were they paying for this in the first place? I don't know if some of you know this history, but infant circumcision passed the 50% mark in the United States, somewhere around 1933, 1934. Len Glick has this in his book. By the end of World War II, the rate was somewhere in the 65 to 70%. It peaked right around the time I was born, around 1960, at 90%. And some people even say that, among white middle-class families it was 95%. That's the highest it's ever been here in the United States. What really drove that was two factors. One a wonderful book, wonderful in for the most part, a book called Baby and Child Care by the most renowned pediatrician in the United States, Dr. Benjamin Spock, from a very prominent Presbyterian New England family. And he had a section on circumcision in this book. Now, why this book was significant, and it was a runaway bestseller. It was #2 in sales only after the Bible. Everybody had this book in their house. And for decades, maybe for centuries, mothers had gotten their advice on how to raise children from their own moms and their grandmoms and their aunts and everybody else. But this was part of the new trend in America of individualism. I don't want to have to reach out to my family for advice. I'll research it myself. And this book answered those questions. Told you everything about potty training, told you everything about discipline, told you everything about everything. I remember being fascinated as a kid reading this book and learning about the fontanelle. But there was a section on circumcision, and Benjamin Spock offered parents 3 options. He said, option #1, you can circumcise your child. And I think this is the best option. I think it's the normal one. It's good for health, but the most important factor is psychological, because if all the boys in the neighborhood are circumcised, you don't want Johnny to be the only one with a foreskin, because he might not grow up normal. That's actually the language he used in the book. He won't grow up normal, which some of us took as code for you don't want him to turn out gay, so make sure you cut his foreskin off. Option #2 was, from the day you bring the baby home from the hospital, you can pull back the foreskin, make sure you pull it all the way back, rip the adhesions. It's going to be very painful. There will be a lot of crying by the baby and probably just as much crying by the mother. He actually said that. And he said, but that's your other option. And then he listed a third option, which he said, or you could just leave it alone until he's a teenager. That's what they do in most of the world, but I don't recommend that. So the message was very clear. You really should circumcise your child. Well, simultaneously, the U.S. was experiencing tremendous inflation, and unemployment was practically zero, because we were the first country to really recuperate from World War II, from the tremendous economic hits of that. And we were really headed for a super inflationary period. So President Truman put in wage and price controls, which was a dramatic, draconian approach to this problem. So you couldn't compete for employees on salary or hourly rate or anything like that. You couldn't raise it. What wasn't mentioned was benefits. So suddenly, Americans went from mostly not having health insurance. If they had circumcision done, they paid for it themselves, and it was a $25 fee that you paid to the doctor to get your kid cut back then. But suddenly, every company in America, every employer was offering health insurance and dental insurance and vision insurance and a company car and 2 weeks paid vacation and more. And suddenly, everyone was getting insured through their work. And these insurers took the advice from Dr. Spock in his book and made sure that in the maternity benefit, infant circumcision was included. It was in every damn health plan in this country. So from 1945 to 1960, we went from 65 to 70% infant circumcision, right on up to 90%. That's how we got ourselves in this universal circumcision problem. And the rate has been coming down since then. I'm going to deliver some bad news to you all. There's a lot of numbers put out there. Some of the misinformation, disinformation that we were talking about yesterday that I think is not helpful to the movement. There's several things that activists say that are incorrect and I think ultimately hurt us. One of them is, circumcised men are really unhappy about this and they're not able to function sexually. As much as I'm a dedicated intactivist, that's bullshit. Most circumcised guys have a great sex life. And the fact of the matter is, most circumcised men in the United States are happy to be circumcised. They don't have a problem with it. They're either neutral on it or they're happy. Really, a minority are dissatisfied. But here's the kicker. when they do these surveys, and we have seen many of these surveys, yes, something like 85% of circumcised American guys are content or even happy about being circumcised, but 90% of intact guys are happy. So the satisfaction rate is even better if you leave your kid alone. That's the part that they leave out, that they don't tell you about that, because it's implied that circumcised men are happy, so intact men must be unhappy, and that's not the case at all. Another thing that is real misinformation that they tell people is that the rate has gone under 50% in the United States. That, you know, we have achieved the tipping point, and they point to things like the 2010 CDC thing that got reported at the Vienna AIDS conference. I was there, I was in person, I was working the Intact America booth at the AIDS conference in Austria, and I was talking to Dr. El Bashauri, who was with the CDC, young guy. He was the one who was narrating when the CDC put on the screen in a session that the US infant circumcision rate had dropped from 56%, which at that point was the most recent HHS hospital discharge survey, which was entirely voluntary. He said it's gone from 56% to 45%, and it's currently 34% in the United States. And of course, we leapt into action. Brian O'Donnell, another intactivist, was in that session with me. We immediately reported that back to Georgianne Chapin. Georgianne contacted the New York Times, and ultimately the CDC retracted that and said, oh, it was some kind of an error. We had a vendor who ran these numbers for us, and we shared them with the whole world without vetting them. So they had to backpedal on that. But a lot of intactivists got the wrong message from that and thought that the rate is now really low. And I see it every damn day on social media. I see it on Reddit. I see it on X, Twitter. I see it on Blue Sky. I see it everywhere where intactivists are saying, well, you know, now a majority of American boys are being left intact. Well, I have a cold bucket of water for you. The US circumcision rate currently stands at somewhere between 70 and 72%. And that is calculated by combining the HHS figures of 56% for the hospital discharge. And again, I stress that that's entirely voluntary. We don't have a data collection system like countries with universal health care do, because they pay out on almost every single procedure, so they keep detailed records. They can tell you down to the last boy in the country, except for the few that are done in private clinics. They can tell you how many circumcisions were done in any given year in their country. We can't. We don't keep data on that. Almost intentionally, we prefer the private system, so that is not made available to the public. But we do have an intactivist colleague. I'm not going to share his name because he doesn't want any recognition for this, but he is an actuary. He knows statistics very well. He's worked with insurance companies for many years. He knows how to interpret the data, and he paid privately out of his own pocket to purchase the entire US's worth of data from HHS. So instead of those top line numbers that we were getting, like the 56%, he actually got it for every single hospital in the United States. And that's how I know that in Miami, the area where I live, that most of the hospitals have about a 28% infant circumcision rate. Some of that is the high Hispanic population that we have. But there is a particular chain of hospitals owned by Baptist Health where the circumcision rate is 85%. And so it is painfully obvious that that is a revenue center for that hospital. It's no coincidence that the 3 hospitals that they own in our area have an 85, right across the board, 85% circumcision rate, when the regional average is 28%. So something is going on there. They're seeing it as a moneymaker. And so clearly their doctors are being instructed to sort of push this. And this is also the area in South Miami where we had a somewhat famous lawsuit about 10, 12 years ago, where the parents had said, we don't want our son circumcised. The mother was giving birth in the hospital. She said, my family doesn't do it, my husband's family doesn't do it, we see it as mutilation. Their doctor, the one who delivered the baby, was off the next couple of days. They had a substitute OB come in who, without paying any attention to the chart, whatever, took the baby off and circumcised her. And the parents sued, and they settled for a really significant amount of money. You can look it up, it's the South Miami case. But that has happened all over the country, that the parents' wishes are not observed. And by having this granular level of information down to every hospital, we can spot the trends. We can spot the individual institutions that are clearly soliciting this the most because they have outlier high infant circumcision rates compared to their areas. And it's no guarantee when a state gets out of the Medicaid business of infant circumcision, because some places, like in California, we've seen this in the East Bay, there are signs in the maternity ward saying California hasn't paid for infant circumcision on Medicaid since September of 1982, but talk to us because we know ways around that. And what they're basically saying is they're coding it differently. When they put it down for insurance reimbursement, they're putting it down as a different code, which is essentially fraud and subject to triple damages. So there are places where the doctors and the nurses and most importantly the hospitals that see this as a revenue center are not willing to let go of this, even if the state defunds it. So they're looking for sort of wily ways that they can still collect the money for this, which is why the rates are not as low as they could be. They really should be much lower, even here in Oregon, even in Washington State, Nevada, California, and a bunch of other places that don't pay for it. But back to the law side of it, so I ended up doing my law studies, first in Virginia and then in Chicago, in Illinois. And while I don't practice law, I've been a part of many of the legal cases. And I was one of the first founding people of ARC, Attorneys for the Rights of the Child. Stephen Svoboda and I, when we were doing our initial interviews for interns for ARC, we did those in my office in San Francisco. And it's really important that we have the legal side of this. We've not had the successes that we should have had over the years, and we've heard some incredibly disappointing things from judges. But the thing that we have got to get, the critical piece, and you'll be hearing this from my colleagues when they come up here and talk about the legal side of this, is we have not proven circumcision is a harm, to the extent that a court wants to hear that. Now, there have been some nuggets. We had the Cologne Appeals Court in 2012 actually state that circumcision was a de facto harm. We had a British judge right around the same time say that circumcision is a harm. Now, we've always relied on English common law for saying parents can do, pretty much whatever they want for their kids, particularly when it's in their best interest. But what we have got to keep hammering home is, number one, infant circumcision is not a medical procedure. For it to be a medical procedure, it would require a diagnosis of illness, there's some disease going on, injury, something has happened to the penis that needs to be repaired, or a birth defect that is, and not just a defect, but a defect that is obstructive and interferes with life functions. Maybe the baby's having trouble peeing or something else. So unless it is illness, injury, or obstructive deformity and has a valid diagnosis of that, there is no medical basis for doing infant circumcision. In fact, I've kind of dismissively taken to calling it recreational circumcision because I can't think of another term that actually describes what we're doing in the United States. And we're doing parents a tremendous disservice by not informing them fully. I mean, informed consent would list not only all of the risks of doing this, but it would also include the benefits and functions of the intact penis. It would talk about the importance of the frenulum, the importance of the foreskin, the importance of the meatal lips at the end of the urethra for keeping the urethra free of pathogens and disease. And those meatal lips, as we were just discussing a few minutes ago, they pretty much disappear in neonatally circumcised boys. Probably less than 20% of men who have been circumcised as infants still have these important meatal lips that close shut. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, approach me later and I will be happy to graphically discuss what the anatomy involved is. But this leads to the disingenuous information being put out by the other side. There are things that, by omission and by outright lying, they're really clouding this issue for not just the medical profession, but for the courts. The courts are relying on these things that they're reading and seeing. They're relying on the AAP, they're relying on the CDC, which incidentally, the CDC is not conducting any of its own studies on circumcision. They're relying on HHS, they're relying on the AAP, and they're also kind of misstating what their findings were. But I'll give you an example. We talk about risk-benefit analysis of circumcision, and they say, well, the health benefits are this. Yes, they're speculative. Yes, they're theoretical, but we consider them to be real potential benefits. And then on the other side, we have risk. What is risk? Risk involves not just surgical risk, which is what the AAP is talking about. They're talking about, did the baby bleed out in the circumstance? They're not talking about any other risks, like skin bridges that develop, skin tags, a nicked glands, a crooked scar, keloid scars. They're not talking about any of these complications from circumcision. They're talking about a very narrow subset of risk, which of course benefits their conclusion, their argument. And when they're talking about benefits, they don't highlight the fact that the risks are very real, but the benefits are speculative. And in the real world, in evidence-based medicine, we don't really see these benefits playing out. It's not like the US. There has never been a single study in the United States that has definitively shown that our practice of widespread circumcision since the 19-teens and 20s has ever protected American health to any extent. That study does not exist. So we just like to have this narrative that we're circumcising boys to protect them. But it's not backed up by any real world evidence. So when they talk about risk-benefit is a very real analysis tool. It is the tool that you use when you're choosing between treatments that are absolutely necessary. Let's say you're diagnosed with cancer and your doctor offers you 3 different options for treating it. That's when you look at risk-benefit, because you know that the procedure, something has to happen, and you're trying to look for the least damaging, or the one that gives you the best chance of a successful outcome and of surviving. The correct analysis tool for an elective procedure, like infant circumcision, is not risk-benefit. It has never been risk-benefit. It is advantages, disadvantages. And that would take into account the entire universe of functions of the foreskin and the frenulum. But they don't want to use that analysis tool because they will never be able to get to their conclusion, the one they want, with that. So they mislead the public, and the public says, oh, risk-benefit, that sounds like a great way to evaluate this. No, in medical ethics, that is not the appropriate yardstick for this situation. So that's an example of one of the ways that they mislead us, and the public has no idea because they don't know that risk-benefit is not the appropriate tool to use for that. Why are insurance companies paying for infant circumcision at all? I saw an article, when I lived in San Francisco, I was reading the New York Times, and they had an article called The Supreme Court of Medicine. And it was a really fascinating profile on a company called Milliman and Robertson. They still exist, but they have a different name. They were bought up by another company. But in 1997, shortly before I was fired from my executive position for my activism, I was really riled up about this. I really, wanted to explore every possible avenue to bring an end to infant circumcision. So what did I do? I researched Milliman and Robertson. What's the next thing I did? I got on the phone to Seattle and called them and told them who I was and told them that I wanted to talk to them about this, because what the article was about was how some of you might remember this. This was around the time that they were kicking moms out of maternity wards within 24 to 48 hours after giving birth. It used to be, back in the 50s and 60s, that you were in the maternity ward for 5 to 7 days, and every day they came in and put your makeup on you and served you bonbons and fruit, and it was basically, after you gave birth to the baby, it was a vacation in the maternity ward for a while. Milliman came in and said, no, bottom line, we gotta be looking at this, we're gonna kick you out after 36 hours. If the baby's healthy, there's no reason you shouldn't be at home. They did this with other things. They opined on things like cataract surgery. Should you do both eyes in one day? They opined, there was almost not a medical procedure that could be done on you that was not decided on by Milliman's expert team. And importantly, about 80% of the health insurance companies in the country contracted with Milliman and Robertson to tell them what should we be paying for and how much should we be paying for it. So I called them up, I talked to their vice president, I'm not going to mention his name right now, his name was David, but I'll say his last name. He was a nice guy, and he was VP for this area, for policy stuff. So I explained who I was, I explained that, I was an intactivist, I had to explain what an intactivist was. I told him I had given interviews to the Times of London, to the Wall Street Journal, to USA Today, I've been on television, I've done a bunch of things. I was in Tim's movie, Whose Body, Whose Rights. And if you haven't seen that, by the way, look for it. It's on YouTube, right?
It's on YouTube in the American Archive of the Broadcasting website.
Okay, it's a great movie. It was groundbreaking because no documentary had really been made about this up until then. And as Tim said, it was phenomenally well received. So I mentioned that to David. And I said to him, so let's talk about circumcision. And he was like, what? And I said, well, you guys don't seem to have an opinion on circumcision. You haven't given a recommendation to any of your subscriber companies. I mean, how much should be paid for it? Why is it being paid at all? What are your thoughts on it? Should it be done on a healthy newborn? And he said, well, what do you see as the problem? And I said, okay, well, let's talk about the foreskin. I mean, it's a normal part of anatomy. It's blah, 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 and I talked for like 5 minutes. There was silence at the other end. And I said, are you still there, David? And he said, yes, I'm just trying to adjust to the fact that you're able to say the word foreskin without stuttering. It just, the few times in my life I've ever had to say that word, I get like really nervous. And I said, well, in your field, you're going to need to get over that. And I talk about foreskins every day. So yeah, I don't stumble over the word, but I would appreciate it if you looked into this for me and told me why you guys have not made an official recommendation on this. And he shared a private story. He said, my son was born here and our insurer was Group Health of Puget Sound. And I said, well, they don't cover it. They dropped it in 1989, I believe it was. And he said, oh, my son was born in 87, and they covered it, and we did it. And I said, well, you might want to look into this because, since you guys didn't make a recommendation on it, they looked into it themselves, decided that it was not cost effective and was not helpful, and so they have dropped it. So right there in your own backyard, they're not paying for it. And I believe that it might still not be paying for it, but we've had mixed results with this. Tim will remember this. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Pennsylvania, they dropped infant circumcision in 1986, and they put it right back in 1989 after 3 years of seeing that their competitor health plans did not drop it, and they were tired of being the lone one just hanging out there. So they put it back in. We want to prevent that from happening. And one of the best ways to do that is to get Medicaid circumcision out of your state. So David went and researched this, and he said, I'll call you within a week. I hadn't heard from him in about 10 days, so me being the dogged follower up that I am, I called him again, and I was like, hey, remember me? And he said, yeah, I looked into this. I talked to our board of directors. I talked to our ethics panel about it, and he was a good guy. Don't get me wrong. David sincerely wanted to answer my question. He sincerely wanted to help us. But he said, I was told, do not ever say the word circumcision at this company again if you want to continue working. It was the third rail of medicine. You could not bring it up because it was a hot potato. It had religious overtones, it had cultural overtones, it had historical overtones, and they did not want to go into this. And I thought to myself, if the number one health consultancy in the United States, who is, as the New York Times said, the Supreme Court of Medicine, their word was law on what gets covered, if they would not touch infant circumcision, this went even deeper. We talk about going down the rabbit hole on circumcision. This suddenly, opened up, another mile of rabbit hole. That there was a lot of stuff going on because they would not touch it. And David apologized to me. He said, "I am so sorry. I didn't know this going into it, but you can appreciate that I can't push this with my superiors because they'll take action against me." So that's how deeply ingrained this is in the United States, and what a terrible problem it is. But, so number one, I'm trying not to swear, get the money out of infant circumcision. It has been subsidized for too long, and subsidized on the taxpayer dollar. As people said yesterday, 40 to 45% of births in the United States occur under Medicaid. Can you imagine the impact it would have if we got all the states to stop paying for it? Now, we like to say, Britain got out of the circumcising business back in the very early 1950s. The National Health Service came into effect in 1948, July of 1948. In fact, we had a symposium at the University of Oxford to mark that. We were all there in the summer of '98 for the 50th anniversary in 1998. And we had a doctor there, probably the country's top pediatrician, Anthony Wickwood, was that his name, Wickwood? He said, we have an epidemic of later circumcisions in the UK. It's as high as 15% of boys who are being circumcised for phony phimosis. We thought we got out of the circumcision problem in the 1950s, but doctors continued to cut boys. Anytime a parent would bring the kid in and say, his foreskin's not going back, or he's ballooning, or whatever, the correct thing is for the doctor to say, this is normal, leave him alone, it'll resolve by puberty. But they had a really, I'd say, high circumcision rate from toddlers to school-age boys. So he said, we're going to bring that down. And indeed, he made a pledge at our symposium, and within, I think, about 8 or 10 years, they brought the rate down in the UK from 15% to 5%, which was great. And we need doctors in the US who are pledged to a similar Manhattan Project to tackle this specific problem. But right now, we have not engaged the medical profession to that extent. People say, why can't we emulate what the UK did? Well, again, they have a universal health care program that essentially doesn't pay for this. And I want to clear up a mistake. A lot of Americans thinking in American terms are thinking that the UK delisted infant circumcision or took it off their formulary. There is no formulary. That's not how the NHS works. The NHS works on necessary procedures, and if a particular doctor requests something, they'll review it, but they just didn't have doctors coming to them saying, I need to circumcise this particular healthy newborn boy. That's why it isn't getting done. Now, Canada had a formulary, and they used to circumcise with all their provincial health plans, and starting with Alberta in 1982, and then BC in '84, we were talking about this, Mike, the other night at dinner. Province by province, Canada got out of the infant circumcision business, which is what has essentially brought the rate down from about 85% at its peak to 20 to 25%, depending on the region. Now, the Maritimes don't circumcise at all. They haven't done that for decades. It's more a question of Ontario and some of the western provinces. So, and Canada has a unique situation. They had a law that said if our national health plan, provincial health plans, are in the business of doing a procedure, private medicine cannot compete with us. So if we do knee replacements, there can be no private knee replacements. Once they got out of the circumcision business, it opened up the door for circumcision clinics to proliferate, which is why Neil Pollock started operating clinics all over Canada to do circumcisions. Australia, there's a myth that in Australia, Medicare, their national health care program, stopped paying for circumcision, and that's why it ended. That is not entirely correct. To this day, in 2025, Medicare is still paying for infant circumcision in Australia because the legislators cannot get a spine and remove it. There's an allowance of, I think, 250 Australian, which is, I don't know, like 25 cents. And so they're still paying this, and that money can be paid directly to a private circumcision clinic, so that it lowers the cost to the family of getting a baby circumcised. I'm kidding, it's something like $15, but I'm sorry, $150. But the point is that Medicare, circumcision in Australia didn't stop. It went from a peak in the 1950s of 95% to approximately 8 to 10% today. And that did not occur because they defunded circumcision. They're still paying. Now, thank God, they're still paying the same amount in 2025 that they were paying in 1980. So that has had some effect. But that is not the real reason. In New Zealand, it went from 98% in the 1950s to essentially 0% now. And that was, again, not because of a defunding question, because infant circumcision was covered under they had national health care starting in 1939. They were supposed to do it together with the UK because New Zealand and the UK are very closely aligned medically, but something, I don't remember exactly what, happened in 1939 in the UK. Anybody? World War? So they deferred the start of the NHS from 1939 to 1948, but New Zealand went ahead with it. But they got out of the circumcision business. And what do these all have in common? The answer is not they defunded it or it wasn't included in their national health care, because as we see, some of these countries still try to pay for it. The medical profession turned against it. Never in the history of the world has any country or culture or society or religion taken up infant circumcision because of a pressing health need. Nowhere. No, not in the US, not in, Canaan in ancient times. Nowhere. Nowhere have they done this because there was a foreskin problem. Similarly, no one has extricated themselves from the circumcision problem because parents suddenly lost interest in it or asked doctors not to do it. It was the medical profession. That is the consistent theme, the medical profession turning against this first. So keep that in mind. I'm not saying it can't happen in the United States, but it would be a bit of a miracle if that happened. So we need to focus on getting the money out of infant circumcision, all the subsidies, and as someone said yesterday, it's a direct payment from the insurance company to the doctor or the hospital. We need to focus on turning the minds of doctors and nurses on this and stopping this being a revenue center for doctors' offices and for hospitals. Those are, in my opinion, the most effective places we can put our resources to getting out of the scourge of infant circumcision in this country. There's a million other things that I want to tell you guys. I hope some of this has been helpful. If you want to follow up with me later, I've got a lot more to say. But thank you for listening. I hope it helps paint a little bit better picture of where we are and maybe puts a roadmap on where we want to go with law cases. So where we're going to go from our historical situation to hopefully much more successful litigation moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. As we promised, we had a great lineup. This mic is picking up, okay? So I guess we'll maybe have a couple questions for Martin. Martin's going to be here, so as you know, he knows practically everything about this movement and the history and how, what works, what doesn't. I see you, Brian, and we'll come to you, Tim.